Curious Naked Diatribes. Curious Naked Diatribes. Curious Naked Diatribes. Curious
Greetings and blessings, and welcome to another edition of Curious Naked Diatribes. Well, not just another edition, but a series, in fact, on the elections in the United Snakes of America. There's quite a lot I wanted to cover, and in part one of the series, I want to talk about the Electoral College, its racist origins, and what it would take to hopefully get rid of it someday. But first, just a few thoughts by way of introducing the series. So here we are, folks. 2024 is drawing to a close, and that means folks are getting ready to go to the polls again in November to cast their votes for the next U.S. president. Wonderful. Now, I don't know if you remember the first time you voted, but for me it was the 1992 election between Bill Clinton and George H.W. Bush. Oh yeah, and there's this other little guy, who was it? Yeah, Ross Perot, the Texas millionaire, back when being a millionaire was really something special. Okay, so trivia question, because who doesn't love trivia? What was the political party Ross Perot ran with? Here's a hint. It wasn't with either of the major parties. And you got to listen to the end for the answer. Before I continue, I want to offer a warning, a trigger warning, if you like, to any listener who is a staunch supporter of the Republicans or the Democrats and who doesn't like to hear criticism, because I got plenty for both. That said, I guess at the time of the election 92, I must have felt a certain sense of pride in having voted for the winner. But since then, as I've come to learn a great deal more about the U.S. political system, I just shake my head at that younger me who believed that the Democrats were the good guys who stood up for poor and working people, the real backbone of this country. I no longer believe that, nor do I believe that the United States truly has a functioning democracy. And I hope over the course of this series, you'll have an understanding of why I say this. Let's start with the elections themselves, and then move on to the other 364 days of the year. I'm first going to look at two elections, and you'll see later why they're significant.
Stand by. CNN right now is moving our earlier declaration of Florida back to the too close to call column. 25 very big electoral votes.
You may remember the election of 2000. It was a race between then Vice President Al Gore, a Democrat, and Republican George W. Bush. One that was so close, it came down to a court-ordered recount in the one state that would decide the outcome, Florida. Now, this may come as no surprise to you, but Florida only voted blue in 3 of the last 11 elections. Now, you may be asking, wait, what do you mean Florida voted? Don't people vote? Well, yes and no. Don't worry, we're getting to that. So the 2000 election was one of 5 U.S. elections in history, and 2 in the last 20 years, in which the winner did not win the popular vote, but instead won the most electoral votes. And it's also worth noting that this election was one that was ultimately decided by the U.S. Supreme Court in a very controversial decision. The vote was 5-4 in favor of George W. Bush. So in a sense, you could say Gore lost this election by a single vote. And it wasn't yours.
This has been an extraordinary election.
Let me give you another example.
I was against it once it was finally negotiated and the terms were laid out. I wrote about that in...
You called it the gold standard.
I hope...
You called it the gold standard of trade deals. You said it's the finest deal...
2016, the race between Hillary Clinton from the Democratic Party and Donald Trump, the Republican candidate. At the time, there was a hilarious, and I would add brilliant, Twitter profile with the name Dollary Clump. Brilliant. Now, for the record, I'm not a MAGA Trumpster by any means. And yet I didn't like Hillary then, and I like her even less today. But whatever your political flavor happens to be, the fact remains that Clinton won the popular vote by about 3 million votes in the 2016 election. But again, because we have the Electoral College, this anti-democratic piece of crap system in place, she lost to her rival Donald Trump. So you may have noticed that neither of the two most recent Republican presidents won the popular vote, but instead got sworn in because they got the most electoral votes. So how does this happen? Well, it's a bit confusing, but basically it works like this. When people go to vote in the US, they're not actually voting directly for the president, but rather the state's electors who do vote for the president. With the exception of Nebraska and Maine, it's a winner-take-all system. So if a Democrat gets 51% of the vote in California, for example, that candidate gets all of the state's 54 electoral votes. The number of electors is determined by the state's population, which also determines the number of state representatives. So the magic number is 538, the total number of electors in the United States. And the number of electoral votes needed to win the election is 270. But here's where it gets really messed up. In many states, the electors are not even required to vote according to the popular vote. These are called faithless electors. And once you start going down this rabbit hole, you really have to wonder about this so-called democracy. But I think to really understand democracy in the US, you have to get into its legacy of racism and slavery. I mean, how can you really have a democracy ruled by the people when you don't really believe that people are people? The Electoral College system has been with us since the days of the Founding Fathers, when the US was only a handful of states, and the folks who got to vote were basically white male property owners. That was the founders' vision of democracy. White male property owners got to enjoy democracy. And so these handful of states at the time were divided between pro-slavery and anti-slavery. And because enslaved people didn't really count as people, that left the southern states at a distinct disadvantage. They simply didn't have enough free people to vote. And the compromise was the infamous 3/5 clause. What's that, you ask? The 3/5 clause is a provision of the United States Constitution that states that 3/5 of enslaved people would be counted towards a state's population for the purposes of taxation and representation in the House of Representatives. And what? Yes, the Electoral College. You got that? You're an enslaved person. You can't vote. You're not a whole person, but 3/5 of a person, only for the purposes of helping your pro-slavery state win elections. Sound democratic to you? Me neither. So to this day, we still have this system, a racist legacy that is unique in the entire world. No other country uses it. So why do we still have it? Good question. It happens to be very unpopular, unless of course you're someone who benefits from it. In fact, support for replacing the Electoral College system was as high as 80% around 1970. So what would it take? Well, it would take another constitutional amendment. And here's something else to think about. It wasn't until 1971, in the Vietnam War, that the Constitution was amended again to allow 18-year-olds to vote. Until then, you could go off to fight and die in a war and still not be allowed to vote. So, as unlikely as it may seem, I really hope we can put an end to the Electoral College soon. All right, you've listened all the way to the end, so as promised, here's the answer to the trivia question. And I admit it was a bit of a trick question. Ross Perot ran as an independent in the 1992 election, but later founded the Reform Party in 1995. Hats off to any of you astute history buffs who weren't fooled by that one. Thank you for listening. Stay tuned for part 2 in the US Selections series. Until then, que todo sea amor, walk tall, live free.
Javi Media.